At the time. Welcome back. Thanks again for joining us. Morning Live continues. We take a look at something that's very interesting and as old as time itself. Well, South Africa is still among the countries with the lowest breastfeeding rates. Now, only 8% of mothers do so exclusively compared to 85% of women in Rwanda. Experts say that if this continues, child mortality rates will always be high. Well, to tell us more about this issue now, we're joined by Kezia Kent. She's from the Association of Dietetics in South Africa. Kezia, thank you so much for joining us. Good morning to you.
Morning.
As old as time, as I said, breastfeeding, the nutritious value and the facts thereof, we know it's always been repeated again and again, and yet we're seeing in South Africa that more and more women are not breastfeeding. Why not?
Well, basically, you can start bringing it back to the same mortality rates. Mortality rates in infants and children are increasing, breastfeeding rates are decreasing. Now, that already must be your direct correlation. What can we do to change this? Now, the biggest thing is, why aren't women in South Africa breastfeeding? There's quite a few topics and quite old topics that have been around. Number one, a lot of mothers are quite scared that there's not insufficient milk, or there's not enough milk coming through. Number one, we can't see the amount of milk being produced. So mothers, we are unfortunately quite scared. Is the baby actually having enough? Is the baby suckling on air? What's actually going in? So there's already the miscommunication between the mother and the child already, just visually, to say what is exactly going on. The other biggest factor that we have in South Africa is that HIV, sort of the worry that is the HIV going to be transported into the breast milk? Will my child become HIV infected at the same time if I am an HIV positive mother? And now that's the scariest point that, as a lot of South Africans, we are facing at this point in time. There are a lot of regulations and a lot of, let's say, education that we have put in place to show that breastfeeding, exclusive breastfeeding, is safe for HIV positive mothers who are on any kind of antiretroviral treatment, and for mothers who aren't on antiretroviral treatment. There is a moving forward, let's say, standard that we do have in place.
You spoke about the correlation between breastfeeding and the mortality rates among infants. Let's take a look at the relationship between breastfeeding and development now in a country. Are we seeing that the more modern, more developed woman is perhaps seeing breastfeeding as being inferior, being more rural?
More of a cultural standard that, you know, and that's the one thing that we started as South Africa bringing in. It's called the International Code of Breastfeeding Marketing. And we brought this into South Africa particularly because of this cultural shift that we went through. A lot of mothers were rather formula feeding because they thought, well, yeah, I can afford the formula, it will be better for my child. Meanwhile, breast milk has been there from day one. It's always been the best, let's say, best feeding route for any kind of infant or any child. So the first thing is we've set this code in place so that there's no advertising of any formula. There's no posters, there's no pamphlets given out to mothers promoting formula feeding. Even any formula feeding company will always put on their tins of formula that breastfeeding is always the best option, so that we can try and promote breastfeeding as being the most preferred method of feeding your infant, as well as the best method for feeding the child.
So making breastfeeding option A and formula plan B.
Plan B. There are certain children that have to have formula feeding per se, not in any kind of HIV context, but more on, let's say, a child that maybe has certain conditions like galactosemia, phenylketonuria. These are certain diseases and conditions that a child has to be on formula feeding. So there's not to say if a mom's got HIV, if a mom is on certain medications, that can always be, let's say, monitored by a doctor on hand, a child will still be able to be breastfed.
So this is a whole industry that could be affected by this.
Yes, yes. And also, I mean, our children are the future. We can't just be, second guessing their nutritional values. We have to feed them. We have to enhance their early development now, so that they can move on. And so, number one, decreasing mortality, but number two, enhancing their lifestyle going forward from, let's say, infancy into childhood, going into teenagers.
Let's talk about working mums now.
Yes.
and the supply of milk. I found personally that when I had to wake up early and I had a very rigorous schedule, that it does affect your breast milk production. How do you balance the scale? And we can also maybe bring in the recent incident where a radio personality breastfed on air saying I needed to feed my baby. Just talk to us about that balance between working mums and milk supply.
Okay, so number one, there is that 3-month maternity leave that we do have. As moms, that is your most important gap that you can take to develop that bond between you and your baby when you are breastfeeding. So the big thing is now it's that postpartum support and that after birth support that you would get, is to say, what do we do now from breastfeeding? Do we understand that you can already express? Do we understand that you can actually freeze your breast milk? Do you understand that you can put it in a refrigerator? Every mom has to understand the processes that get involved. Let's say once you have to go back into a work situation. Number one, stress does cause a lot of, let's say, decreased production of breast milk. So the first thing you have to realize is that your child will still get fed. Even though you are at work, you can still express your breast milk. So number one, your stresses will already be decreased. And the second topic that you did mention is that, how are we going to be moving forward as a society? Do we still see breastfeeding as this very, how do I say it, it's very like a harsh sort of society where we say, well, should a mom be feeding in public? And my personal opinion, every child has the right to food. So why are we sort of setting a degree for moms breastfeeding as opposed to a mom feeding formula in a restaurant, for example? So I am happy that a radio personality did take that stance and move forward to show you that it's not all taboo. A mom has to feed her baby, regardless if it's breast milk or if it's formula feeding.
Quality milk
and
as well.
Quality milk, that's the most important. So if your child is being already, there's a lot of support coming from South Africa for moms who are exclusively breastfeeding, then let's do it as a whole. If one mom is doing it, doesn't mean that another mom doesn't have to. Let's, as females, as all South Africans, support everybody who is breastfeeding. There's a lot of degrees of variability to say, do you want to go into a bathroom? Do you want to just cover up? That is the mom's own personal preference. I can't say what you should be doing. If you are worried about what society will say, don't, let's say, put it out there, for everyone to see, but at the same time still show them that you're not really too worried about what they have to say anyway.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us. Kezia Kent is from the Association of Dietetics in South Africa, speaking about breastfeeding. It is, of course, a breastfeeding week, and we've just had that incident, of course, that has caused a Twitter storm, I should say, about breastfeeding radio personality. Well, at the end of the day, baby must eat on demand. Let's leave it there for now. We're going to